In our timeline, Western Rome survived for less than a century, following the division of the empire after Theodosius I's death. Rome would be sacked in 410 by Alaric and the Gauls, symbolic of the fall of the empire, and as St. Jerome said, the city, which had taken the whole world, was itself taken. But what if it wasn't? What if the fates of Western and Eastern Rome were switched? Join me as we explore what happens if Western Rome survives. In order to answer this question, we'll need to jump in a time machine and go back just a little bit further. The barbarian invasion of Rome is traditionally thought to have began around the year 300, when various groups of people migrated into the Roman Empire fleeing the Huns. In 376, the Goths and Alans were hoping to peacefully settle in the Roman Empire, but were misled by Roman generals like Lupicinus, who extorted and starved them after leading them to settle in the lower Danube region. For example, it is noted that Lupicinus at one point offered food to the tribes after starving them, only to then say that the price of each slaughtered dog was one tribal boy sold into slavery. Humiliated by this, the Goths broke into open revolt, leading to a battle in Adrianople in the year 378. Rome had been ruled by co-Augustuses since 364, when then Emperor Valentinian I appointed his brother Valens co-Augustus to prevent a crisis of succession from the various armies of Rome in the east, who were concerned that the administration would again be centered in the west. The Goths and their Hellenic allies defeated the coalition of Western and Eastern Romans, and even managed to kill the Eastern Roman Emperor Valens in the process. This loss to barbarian armies was not only crippling to the prestige of the Roman Empire, shocking contemporaries of the time period, but also it decimated the officer corps of the Roman army, which now was mainly comprised of barbarian leaders or men of less than stellar records. Follow-up battles led to a stalemate, and finally, the Goths and other tribes were permitted to settle in Rome as foederati, providing troops and resources to the Roman state. When Valentinian I died in 375, his eldest son, who would become Emperor Gratian, took his place as Augustus of the West. Technically, though, he ruled together with his younger brother Valentinian II. This is important for later. He was a fervorous Nicene Christian and removed many pagan traditions from the Roman state. On top of that, he's rumored to have allowed many Alans into his personal bodyguard, and in 383, the Roman army declared a general, Magnus Maximus, emperor. From his seat of power in what would become Trier, he found a strong base of power in Gaul, Britain, Spain, and Africa. Reputedly, Magnus Maximus is said to have issued edicts of administration, coined his own currency, and created numerous administrative positions during his rule. Magnus himself was a strong Christian, and his numerous persecutions against pagans filled his personal coffers. For some 5 years, Magnus Maximus was able to secure legitimate rule from Theodosius, who recognized him as Roman Emperor of the West. By 387, Maximus managed to force Valentinian II out of Mediolanum, taking sole control of Western Rome. All roads at this point to a strong continuation of stable control in the West. However, the successor to Valen, who had died in battle at Adrianople, after his death, was a strong administrator and ambitious ruler of his own right, named Theodosius. In 388, Theodosius married the sister of Valentinian II, Galla, prompting him to move to restore the evicted Augustus to co-emperorship of the West. This is where we will begin our alternate history. In the Battle of the Save, Theodosius the Great and Magnus Maximus clashed their armies together, both bringing the full military force of the empire to bear, following a maneuver campaign of less than 2 months. As Magnus had secured significant funding, he also raised a strong and loyal army of German mercenaries, well paid and trained. However, Theodosius in our timeline took the initiative away from Maximus, and within a year the war was over, with both Magnus Maximus and his son Victor dead after a short siege. However, in our timeline, Maximus defeats Theodosius when Maximus sends his brother Marcellinus to force Theodosius back into the river Save. The fighting was intense, and it lasted all day, and despite heavy casualties of nearly 50% on both sides, Maximus completed his victory. Fleeing the river Save, thanks to his large navy, Theodosius managed to flee to the city of Salona, where the strong Salonian walls provided refuge for his army. However, Maximus was in hot pursuit. It was clear to Maximus already that Theodosius, supposedly his co-emperor, had no or little plan for his power to last in the West. So he laid siege to the city, and after 3 short months, he was offered the emperor and Valentinian II as prize. Maximus put them to death. Maximus, having secured his rule in the West, looked to secure his rule in the East. However, with Theodosius already having bore a son in Honorius, who was already consul despite being only 2 years old, Maximus was unable to gain control of the East. So now, with a much weaker army than he departed with, and a drained war chest used to pay a mercenary army, Maximus and his son Victor returned to Augusta Trevorum, modern-day Trier, and his seat of power, Victorious. This marks the official split of the empire. As we explore an alternate reality where the fate of Western Rome follows one closer to her Eastern counterpart, it is important that we define a few realities that are inescapable and subscribe to a theory of thought as to what caused the crossing of the Rhine in the winter of 406. Firstly, we must come to the reality that the barbarian migrations into the Roman Empire had already began to have happened, and likely they are impossible to stop. It seemed that Theodosius in our timeline came to this conclusion during his reign, so we will as well. Secondly, we will subscribe to the theory that the crossing of the Rhine occurred because Stilicho, who rose to power through service to Honorius, who if you'll remember is dead in our timeline, abandoned the limites of the Rhine to combat the Visigoths in Rome. In our timeline, however, Theodosius dies in 388 alongside Honorius, and Stilicho never rises to power. Due to this, the Suevi and the Vandals do not cross the Rhine into Gaul. Consequentially, with Stilicho never rising to power, Alaric, whose people invade Thrace from the Balkans, succeeds with his campaign in 391. Without the Theodosian walls, Constantinople falls, and Alaric and the Gauls take the city. Roman power flees to Thessalonica, where, due to the naval supremacy of the Eastern Romans, they hold. With these 3 assumptions now considered as fact in our timeline, we can continue truly diving into this alternate reality. Maximus, with his newfound control in his empire, would likely not face struggle like Honorius and Stilicho. Being much closer to Britain and being able to pay his own men well, due to not having the struggles of barbarian incursions into the Western Roman frontier, as they flooded instead into the east, Maximus is able to avoid the constant revolts of Roman Britain. While his war with Theodosius required a manpower drain that did cause him to lose control of Wales and Cornwall to the Celtic invaders of Ireland by 400 when he had to return his legions from Britain towards the mainland, he manages to hold onto the rest of Roman Britain by refilling manpower strength of garrisons and paying his men well. Now, though we don't know exactly when Maximus was born, we do know he was a junior officer by 370. So assuming that he was born around 350, we can assume by 400 he's becoming an old man. In 408, a large Saxon invasion of Britain weighs heavily onto Maximus's mental state, and he dies in 410 in Trier, with the Senate confirming his son Victor Augustus an emperor of Western Rome. We also don't know how old Victor was, but we do know that he was an adult in 388 when, in our actual timeline, he dies, so we will assume him an adult on the throne. Passing around 40 years, somehow, on the death of the last emperor, Majorian, whose family had fled Illyria after the Gothic invasions and settled in Gaul, becomes emperor. Emperor Majorian led a peaceful reign, instituting reforms, reducing the corruption of much of the elder provinces, and reforming the state institutions back into functioning bureaucracies. However, This draws the eye of the Roman Senate, which still ruled from Italy, and who were constantly targeted by his inquiries. So, the Roman Senate calls on a federated general of Gallic origin to rise up and overthrow Majorian. This fails, however, and Majorian dissolves the Senate of the Roman Empire, that being the body that has existed continuously through Rome's history, and in its wake creates a Senate in Trier, where it evolved, becoming a body of high-ranking individuals and a class of noblemen who could only pass resolutions of suggestions to the emperor rather than dictate imperial policy. Also, in his reign, Majorian built the Majorianic walls of Trier, establishing the city as one of the true great cities in the world by the mid-5th century. The next test, and the greatest test to date, for this Western Roman Empire comes in the 480s, when Majorian's heir and general, Aegidius' son, Syagrius, faces off against an encroaching kingdom of the Franks led by King Clovis I. The Franks, who were already living inside of the Roman frontier of Lower Germania, had been able to be subdued, and they became united under Clovis and his tetrarchy, who decided to lead them in a campaign against Western Rome to carve out his own kingdom. It was here at Trier, rather than in our history at Soissons, that Clovis and his 6,000 Frankish warriors met a force of nearly 10,000 Romans, under the command of Emperor Syagrius. Syagrius fights valiantly, defeating Clovis under his city walls, driving the Franks from his lands. Those that remained, who did not fight, were sent to flight by the Roman forces back over the Rhine, where they would reconvene and carve out a kingdom in the future. Over the next 100 years, the Franks then conquered a kingdom over the modern-day Netherlands and northern Germany, throwing many groups into a flight. One of those groups was the Lombards, who invaded Italy. Italy, long just a status symbol for the empire, especially after the consideration of the Senate being removed, was unable to be controlled besides Sicily, and the Lombards create a new kingdom in the region. While the Alps form a natural barrier, raids only sparingly occur into Gaul itself, and officially, Italy's mainland was conquered. Meanwhile, in the east, a great threat arises. The Eastern Roman Empire, who had been battling the Sasanians and barely managing to hold on to their own independence, was already very weak. In the 250 years since we last left them, the Sasanians had conquered Syria, Mesopotamia, and Egypt, but by 620 had lost control over Anatolia due to internal strife. This led to renewed hope in the Eastern Empire, but the resurgence was brief. By 640, the Prophet Muhammad was conquering vast swaths of territory in the name of Islam, fully conquering Anatolia, reducing the Eastern Roman Empire to only Thessaloniki and islands. Unfortunately, the threat doesn't stop in the east. As the power of Islam rises, it's also encroached on by Western Roman Africa, and by 703, the Umayyads had conquered the province of Africa from Rome. This was a significant issue for the Roman Empire of the West, which from henceforth we will call the Triarian Empire, in a similar way to how historiographers call Eastern Rome Byzantium. The Triarian Empire gained a majority of its food from Africa, and after its fall would have suffered a massive famine. This widespread famine would have caused widespread instability in the empire, which would have in turn caused widespread revolts. When the Umayyad armies invaded Hispania in 711, they were welcomed by the Hispano-Roman population with hopes of their situation improving. By 713, Hispania was totally under Umayyad control, and in 717 they crossed the Pyrenees into Gaul for the first time. The Triarian state had long been anticipating this, but they were somewhat powerless to resist such an incursion, so for the next 20 years, the Umayyads raided with impunity into Gaul. In the year 732, desperate to halt the advance of the Umayyads, the Triarian emperor engages them during one of their characteristic raids into Gaul at the Battle of Tours, bringing all of the empire's military might to fruition. Due to the professional nature of his standing army of Gallo-Roman soldiers, who by this time in the 8th century had hybridized into a syndicated culture. What he lacked for in numbers, bringing 10 to 20,000 men to the battle with resources differing, he made up for in experience. The Umayyad commander Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi and the 20 to 30,000 men he brought with him charged countless time throughout the sweltering sun. However, the Triarian emperor held firm, and at the end of the day, he held the ground, destroying the army of the Umayyads and killing the invaded Umayyad general. This battle alone would not stop Umayyad raids into southern Gaul, but never again would they bring such a force, and by 760, these raids had all but ceased. The constant warfare between the Umayyads and the Triarians also brought less control to northern Hispania, where a small native state would be carved out called the Kingdom of Asturias. Over time, the state would grow, eventually becoming the state known today as Spain. While the Triarians were dealing with the Umayyads and the famines that they caused, the Britons became disheveled. For hundreds of years, they lived peacefully with the Roman and then Triarian administration. But now, local warlords began to rule areas of Triarian Britain. When the Triarians were forced to bring all their armies together to face the Umayyad threat, these local warlords rose up, carving out petty states amongst Triarian Britain. These Triarian administrators were pushed out, with Londinium, now at this time called London, became the last stronghold to be conquered. Over about 300 years, many people had migrated from Germany to Britain in flight of the Franks, and many of them were known as Saxons. In a night which came to be known as the Treason of the Long Knives, these Anglo-Saxons seized control over southern England, stealing lands they'd agreed upon to own peacefully. Over the next 300 years, they'd come to conquer all of the Britons, under various sub-kingdoms and sub-states, and eventually, by the 10th century, conquering all of Britain lands, this Anglo-Saxon state came to be known as England. Shifting focus back to the Triarian state, it would have likely undergone a transition similar to the Byzantine state in our timeline, adopting Frankish customs and traditions, while combining them with late Roman administrative practices, becoming a uniquely bureaucratic style not consistent with dukes in the traditional sense that we know from our feudal Europe, but rather public administrators, governing provinces of Gaul in the name of Trier. The provinces would have likely been governed by some type of viceroy or governor, who was the hand of civil authority to the emperor himself. In areas once occupied by Roman garrisons and legions, these would have become theme-like, with the local administrators becoming the military officer of the region. It's possible over time, these military officers would have likely assumed multiple offices of civilian authority, eventually creating semi-medieval provinces. In the presence of enough corruption, these provinces may have even have become hereditary. Lastly, looking across the rest of Europe, we turn back to Italy in the east. The Pope, being never a large landowner in Italy thanks to any reconquest by any state, is spiritual only. Due to this, no papal state is ever created, and in the east, the Visigothic kingdom is still strong, ruling over territory comprising much of the late Byzantine Balkans. They would constantly be in fights with the Bulgars, and for the purposes of our reality today, we'll presume that likely they would have eventually, being positioned as commander of forces in Mesopotamia, and technically still under command of the Romans, eventually became Eastern emperors themselves by the 11th century, overtaking Thessalonica entirely. As we look towards the 10th century, the little rebellious state of Asturias we touched on earlier now is well on its way towards reconquering Hispania from the Moors. In Italy, the Lombards have set up a complex state of duchies ruling over its entirety, except Sicily. The German styles of dukes controlling their cities would resemble modern feudal Italy, but without the papal state separating them, and the differences between northern and southern Italy without a papal state there would not be as apparent as they are today in our history. Still, the Republic of Venice, as a holdout of imperial vestige, nominally paying tribute to Trier, would still become a maritime power, trading with all of Europe. It's likely as well that some coastal cities of Lombard Italy would also adopt this patrician-style republican ideology as well, evolving uniquely distinct from the hierarchical duchies that historically, even in our timeline for the most part, befell Lombard Italy. While England would most likely be the same as we know it historically entering the 11th century, Germany would be much different. It is likely that the Franks would have established a state in Germany rivaling the Frankish Empire we come to know in our own day, perhaps conquering much of the German basin and extending to it its feudal model of counts. One could also speculate that one ambitious Triarian ruler or another may one day be born that could wish to restore the empire to its former western glory. This could be like Justinian the Great in our timeline, but only time will tell. As always, thank you for watching. If you liked the video, please consider leaving a comment, liking, or subscribing for weekly videos discussing alternate history scenarios, historical discussions, and historical documentary series.